Good evening, everyone. My name is Ilse Treurnig, and it is my great pleasure on behalf of everyone at MaRS to welcome you to this MaRS Global Leadership Series event. And we're particularly delighted because it's part of our ongoing partnership with the SIG network that is bringing a series of global leaders around the theme of social innovation, harnessing social innovation through new models of collaborative and cross-sectoral partnerships to Canada. And we're always delighted to have MaRS as one of the stops for these global leaders. And tonight is another example, and it's been a wonderfully enriching part of our ongoing journey to bring global best practices to Canada. As we all know, we live in remarkable times, and it's really a remarkable chance to learn from other innovators in their own right, but also real leaders on the global scene who are looking at the forces influencing global systems of change. And tonight's guest, Charlie Leadbeater, is absolutely on that path, and we're very fortunate to have him with us. I'm going to ask another friend of MaRS, Ellen Mansky, who is our partner at Plan in Vancouver and has had a long-standing relationship with Charlie, to say a little bit more about him and why we should really listen to what he has to say. And I don't need to introduce Al to this community, but he is one of the true pioneers of social innovation in Canada, not only an Ashoka Fellow, but someone who has really changed the landscape of our thinking around managing disabilities, both in families and in communities, but also creating the Registered Disability Savings Plan, which has transformed the financial needs of families with disabilities. So welcome, Al.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks, Ilse. Those were very kind comments. It's my great pleasure to introduce Charlie Leadbeater to you. Likely all of you are here because you've read some or all of the many books and reports and publications that he's authored or co-authored, or seen his TED Talks. I'm glad to have him in Canada because he's been able to, certainly for me and I think for many people around the world, made it easier for us to make sense of how change is made. He's been chronicling and tracking change-making, creative innovation, either as an author, writer, TED Talk presenter, but for me, more importantly, as a practitioner, as an activist, as a researcher, as a consultant. And whether you're here tonight because you know of his work in the area of social enterprise, or because of his interest and commentaries on radical innovation, or because of open government, open data, whatever the reason, I'm sure you'll leave here tonight inspired by his ability to make it easy for us, whether we're in a system, whether we're in government, whether we're outside government, whether an advocate or an activist or a funder. I think he has found ways to make it easy for us to engage in this change-making process, and I think you'll appreciate that tonight. So please welcome Charlie Leadbeater.
Well, thank you very much indeed to Al and Ilse, and to everyone who's brought me to all this way to Canada, which is great, very exciting, because I get a huge opportunity to learn from wherever I go. And what I thought I would do in, 30 minutes or so was just say a bit about where systems of the future might come from. So I guess if we'd been here a century or more ago, people would have been in different ways debating the future of mass education, mass parliamentary systems, the emergence of welfare, a whole range of systems, productive systems, mass manufacturing. And where might we imagine what systems of this century might look like and where they might come from to meet human needs in different ways? One place to start, not because it's the best place to start, but just because it is a place to start, it's one of the places where I have started, is why the web has excited so much excitement. And a guy called, someone who writes about the web and how it's changing both organizations and culture, who I like very much, David Weinberger, in a long time ago now, said the really interesting thing about the web was how it unleashed so much yearning, and what it unleashed a yearning for, and what it had unleashed a yearning for, in his account, was it had unleashed a yearning to be organized and to do things together in different ways that weren't previously possible. And that it had revealed this, both this yearning to do things in different ways and, by reflection, a kind of frustration with how we were organized. And just one very simple way to kind of understand that, I think, and unpick it and see its significance, is not to think, and this I think is often the case, is not to think about technology at all, at least not that technology, but to think about something which is analogous to it, and which might just, it's just one kind of metaphor which might help unlock this sense that systems could be different, that you could achieve not the same but similar ends, but by doing it in a completely different way. And the analogy is wine. So think about the wine industry. Instead of thinking about computers, think about the communications industry through the lens of wine. So if you think about wine as a form of communication, particularly, I mean, not wine itself, but the wine bottle as a form of communication. Well, the wine industry for a very long time was and remains at its top end dominated by the French. And the English are, of course, alternately completely intimidated and very impressed by anything French, including wine. And this also conditions their attitude towards the French wine bottle. And so if you're English and you look at a French wine bottle, it spells one thing and one thing only: embarrassment. Because what the French, if you imagine a conversation between yourself and a bottle of French wine, the conversation sort of goes something like this. If you're English anyway, it goes something like this. It says, I am Chateau Latour Lafitte. You won't know what that means. I come from an appellation called Saint-Emilion-Estèphe. You won't know where that is. And I was made in the year 2007. And I am 13.5% volume of alcohol. And that is it. And I'm not going to tell you anything more. And if you don't understand what that means, you should go on a course. And you should learn my language. And that's why, for the English, French wine is so intimidating, because when you go into a restaurant, then you manage to negotiate this kind of choice between white and red. You just about manage that. And then this completely bewildering kind of array of names presents itself, and you don't want to choose the cheapest, because that would make you look really cheap. And you don't want to choose the most expensive, which are a lot of them. So you sort of go for something in the middle. So in other words, the communication medium is set up to make you feel, if you're English, completely sort of useless, basically. Because in order to understand it, you would have to adopt that industry's language for describing wine, its quality, significance, provenance, all the rest of it. And then it turns out that in the sort of sacred world of the French wine industry, it's designed to mystify people. So even in Bordeaux, the left bank classification of wine is different from the right bank classification of wine. And there are first wines and second wines, and then there's Cru Bordeaux, and there's Cru Bourgeois, and there's all sorts of other things. And people who are in the 5th division can make wine that's as expensive as the 1st division. In other words, it's designed to be opaque. And this automatically puts power in the hands of the people designing the communication system. Now that works, and works in any industry. It works in the law industry, or in the education industry, or in the healthcare industry, or in the politics industry. It works, that strategy. We're in charge of the mode of communication, the language, so long as you don't get the Americans, the Australians, and the New Zealanders coming along with their wine bottles. And so then that's what happens in the sort of 60s and into the 70s. The first Robert Mondavi and then the Australians come in, and they significantly start from a very different kind of question. Their question is not, how do we make the best wine and copy the French? Their question is, how do we persuade people who drink Coke, beer, and coffee to drink wine? So our competitor is not wine, our competitor is Coke, beer, and coffee. And we have to create a wine that appeals to them. And we won't learn how to do that by going to France. Well, we'll learn bits of it. What we'll learn is by looking at Coke, coffee and beer, and then thinking wine as a result. And so then what you get out of that is the Australian wine industry. And the Australian wine industry says, basically in the Australian wine bottle says, I come from a place called Cloudy River. Now, Cloudy River sounds kind of intriguing, and I am made from a grape that sounds a bit like a girl's name, Chardonnay or Sauvignon. And I was made in 2008, but that's completely irrelevant because I taste the same year in, year out. And I come with a very handy screw top, so you can unscrew me and then screw me back up, and you can pour as much or as little. And crucially, what is it that you're eating? And so for the English, the answer to that is by and large chicken tikka. So the Australian wine bottle says, chicken tikka. I go incredibly well with chicken tikka. Have you had a bad day? Put your feet up, unscrew me, eat your chicken tikka, pour some Chardonnay. Can you ever imagine a French bottle of wine saying, I go very well with chicken tikka? But actually, the conversation that the Australian wine bottle sets up with you is one where you can imagine it helping to solve your problem for you. So this is the sort of disruptive innovation of the Australian, the New Zealand, the Chilean, the American wine industry, which is now selling more wine, and more wine is drunk outside of Europe than inside of Europe, because these people attacked it from a different vantage point. They attacked it from the vantage point of, we've got to get people who drink beer to drink wine, not we've got to shift wine drinkers from one kind of wine to another kind of wine. Very, very powerful. And so what's happening with the web and all the devices that people have in their pockets or indeed in their hands, and Apple is the sort of, apogee of that now, is a sort of Australian wine business approach, which is, we're going to make this as simple and as easy and attractive as possible for you to use, whereas all these other guys are giving you stuff that's virtually impossible. And so this sets up a sort of way of thinking about technology and the relationship between consumers and technologies, where the sort of providers create a language which is easy to appropriate and then easy to become yours, and then it spreads and people use it, and people, look at one another and borrow from their behavior. So where does the web fit into that? Well, the significance of the web, and really the open web as opposed to the Apple app web, the Apple managed web, the really open web, is that basically what then happens is a third thing that happens which alarms everyone, both the Australians and the French winemakers, which is that people in their millions and hundreds of millions start planting their own vineyards in their own back gardens. And they start making wine. And they start making wine and pressing it and putting it into bottles and then sharing it with one another through sort of wine collaboratives and cooperatives. And often this wine's completely undrinkable, but it has the sort of sense that it comes from somewhere. And in small communities it gets shared, and some of it becomes incredibly good. And there's just a huge mass and variety of it. And the commercial people hate it because they think these self-helpers are robbing them of commercial markets. And the French hate it because they think this is an awful democratization of taste, and they shouldn't be allowed to make wine. But the disruptive impact is then here are large numbers of people making and drinking wine as opposed to buying and drinking wine. So what's happening in much of our culture is that there is now this three-way competition going on between people who think that culture and media and all information is a sort of hallowed, sacrosanct kind of space that needs to be looked after by people who understand the language and are in control of the institutions and the quality. The sort of commercializers who say, no, 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 let's just let it rip and we'll provide people with great product. And the makers who want to make it in small quantities together. There's a sort of three-way dynamic going on, which is opening up completely different ways to do the same thing, which is how do you make wine and get people to drink it. And the making end of it can be both competition but also potential alliances with the other two, depending on how they play it. But the entire field has expanded. More and more people are involved in it, both in the drinking and the making. Well, that, broadly speaking, is my view of what's happening to culture, is that, broadly speaking, it's all expanding. There's just more of it in many more different forms. It's much more unstable, and it creates new possibilities. Why is that important? Well, one of the reasons it's important is that all this stuff, the web and other things, is, I think, creating a different kind of culture. And it's creating a culture which we've seen play out in the Arab Spring, so-called, but we see in many other places. And it's a culture where people expect to be different. They expect to be able to get information, to have voice, to share things, to link, to associate, to find out, to be open in different ways. And it's creating a different set of expectations then about what institutions should be like. So even if an institution is not directly affected by this, just the culture that it's creating is changing the expectations that people have, and thus what they expect from institutions. And what that means is that that becomes one of the most powerful reasons why the institutions that we have and the systems for which they're responsible come to seem like the French wine industry, detached, self-referential, using their own language, using classification systems that no one can really understand, and thus ripe for disruption. So the web has created new ways for people to create organization together, to do systems. And that matters because we are modern people. So as modern people, we can't live without systems, basically. No one here would, I would gesture, be able to live their lives without systems. We rely on systems. So, every day you will rely on energy systems, water and sewerage systems, transport systems, payment systems, legal systems, technical systems, administrative systems. Our lives are lived kind of bumping around and drawing on and turning to systems. So the kind of degree of choice and sophistication that we have comes from the fact that we're so rich in systems. Systems that we just take for granted, and when they break down, there's some kind of disruption or strike, we become very agitated. So it's impossible, I think, to imagine modern life without systems. But it's also, my feeling is, that in more and more areas we find it virtually impossible to live with the systems that we have. Because the systems that we have do two things. The first thing that they do is that they encourage us to see our own lives through their lens. So we become creatures of the systems that are meant to serve us. So a very prime example is what happened, I mean, basically, you don't want to be in hospital, in my view, longer than 3 days, because after 3 days, you become an object of the system, and after 10 days, you're virtually lost. And if you take an elderly person into a hospital, speaking as someone who's had both parents in hospital for periods over the last, before they died 2 years ago, for long periods, within 3 weeks, they've just become completely institutionalized creatures of the system, robbed of their independence, autonomy, and dignity, and turned into conditions to be managed by a system. The same is true also increasingly in education, where we become fascinated by the tests and the outcomes and the measures that education delivers of what kind of people we are, mistaking education for learning and learning for a good life. So these are the critiques that Ivan Illich and others made of these systems a long time ago. But these systems have become more sophisticated, intense, and increasingly difficult to ascertain your own sense of what a good life might be, absent from or separate from these systems. But even worse, these systems, at their worst, they become self-interested. And so we live in the grip of potentially self-interested systems. Well, they're not just trying to get us to see the world through their lens, they're actually more interested in themselves than they are in us. And so the most self-interested system in the world is the financial system. I mean, the banking, the crash of 2008 and beyond wasn't just the product of this, but it was partly the product of a system that was more interested in making its loans and bonuses than in whether that was a useful and valuable thing to do, driven by a very deep-seated self-interest. But also in public systems, you feel this, that often the system has a strong self-interest to protect itself rather than really to serve us. And so we find ourselves, I think, unable to live without systems, but increasingly at odds with these systems and finding life with them very uncomfortable. And the reason, one of the fundamental reasons for that, is that the other source of value in our lives is not from what systems deliver to us, it comes from our relationships, it comes from empathy. So, these can go together. You can get systems, and this is what I want to talk about, systems that support empathy. The two can go together. Transactions can be the route to relationships. My wife and I fell in love over a series, now 20 years ago, over a series of meals in London restaurants. And at no point did the bill ever come and say 15% extra for falling in love. I mean, it wasn't like after the fizzy water that you then pay for. But the point of the transaction really wasn't the food. The point was to, fall in love. So the value was all about falling in love. The food was just a vehicle. It was just a sort of transaction in the route to that. And that time and again is really what's happening in a lot of our lives, is that the transaction is really just a route to something that's much more valuable. And what's really much more valuable is probably relational rather than transactional. So you try and get Domino's Pizza to deliver some trust, or try and buy some recognition on eBay, or so on and so on. All the things that most matter in our lives fundamentally to our happiness and well-being, lots of research shows, come from relationships. They don't come from systems. They come from love, care, trust, recognition, friendship, all the rest of it. They come from the way that we do things together, not from the way that we have things done for us. So this is a kind of big tension in our lives. And there are lots of people who've written about this kind of tension, not quite necessarily in this way, but in aspects of this. Sociologists, philosophers, neuroscientists. And one is a guy called Simon Baron-Cohen, and Simon Baron-Cohen is a specialist in autism. And this is where I kind of came across this sort of way of thinking applied to autism and Asperger's. And Simon Baron-Cohen says that basically Asperger's and autism is the interaction of two things. One is systematization, and the other is empathy. And Simon Baron-Cohen's view of the world is that autism and Asperger's are in the top left-hand corner. They are people who think highly systematically, but are incapable of making a kind of human connection. So they can remember number plates, they can remember the sequence of bells at St. Paul's Cathedral, they can, you know, do prime numbers up to very high numbers, but they can't make the most basic kind of human connection with people. But it got me thinking to whether this way of thinking, of just thinking of the world through this lens of systems and empathy, could help explicate other issues that we face. And this issue of, well, how would you make systems that we could live with, that really helped us, that created quality of life, and gave us a sense of control? And so, broadly speaking, if you're down here, this is a place you don't want to be. There's no system and no empathy. This is kind of chaotic. Chaotic family, chaotic neighborhood, chaotic city, you name it, chaotic organization. I have worked in some companies which live down in that space. If you're down there, then going up here is at least you get systems. They might be efficient but cold, but at least they're efficient. So you get a sort of some kind of benefit. But often those spaces are unlivable with, and so as a result we find ourselves often trying to go to this space, which is relational but small scale. Difficult to do at scale, but very kind of bespoke and nice. And so this kind of tension between how you escape the bottom left, how you then find yourself in the top left, and then compensate by going down to the bottom right, this is the kind of rat run that we spend a lot of our lives living in, it seems to me, going through that cycle. And so this is one way of thinking about it. Up in the top left, I mean the far top left is Ryanair, the low-cost airline in Britain. So this is high system and no empathy. And it's high system because it has worked out a way of getting more and more people onto more flights at lower cost. And the deal with Ryanair, and the thing that you can say about it, is that in contrast to other systems, at least it's honest. And basically what it is you buy a very, very cheap ticket, and then they declare war on you. And so the progress from arriving at the airport to getting on the plane is like a series of ambushes, where they, at various stages, try and take money from you, whilst humiliating you, basically. But the really bad thing about Ryanair is not that they are declaring war on you, but they encourage you to declare war on the other passengers. So it's not that it's just system against you, it's actually passenger against passenger. That's the real fun they have, I think. And so it leads to this very, very peculiar experience when you're ever queuing for a Ryanair flight. So first of all, I speak from experience. First of all, preparing to get on a Ryanair flight requires constant vigilance. And the constant vigilance is you've got to keep your eye on the screen, but you've also got to have peripheral vision to make sure that no one also getting on your flight has started to move without you realizing it. And once they do, you've got to be ready to get your bags because you don't want to be at the back of the queue. But then if you've got that sort of speedy boarding thing, priority boarding, you've got to the front of the queue, so you're standing there, then what happens is that you see the people coming off the plane, and they're coming off the plane and they're all sort of shaking themselves, and they look as if, you know, they've been through some horrible experience, like they've been in prison, and you're desperate to get on the plane. And somehow the cognitive dissonance, they're trying to escape this experience, but we're trying to get onto it, never really strikes people. But this is a system that has got us kind of where it wants us, and we're kind of trapped with it. Now that is a very, very kind of extreme version. That's right, top left-hand corner. That is an autistic system. But I would gesture that there are too many systems which are heading in that direction, or they feel as if they are. And we don't have enough purchase on them. You know, call center systems, banking systems, you name public systems often feel like that to people. And so because we live, consume and work too much of our time in systems like that, we then search out experiences like this in the bottom right-hand corner. So this is what my wife and I and our kids do on a Saturday morning, because we've spent so much time sort of negotiating our way through uncooperative systems. On a Saturday morning, we get on our bicycles and we cycle along a canal to a place called Broadway Market, which is a farmer's market, where we buy the most expensive tomatoes in human history. And we are prepared to pay that price because, A, the tomatoes are kind of covered with a smattering of earth, but also we have a conversation with the guy who sells them to us from a wicker basket, and we get some sense that we're involved in some sort of authentic organic process which has led to the creation of these tomatoes, and then we go home. And then, of course, we realize we haven't got any orange juice or toilet roll or detergent or dishwasher tablets or anything like that. And so then we go into system land and we place some huge order on some online supermarket which delivers it to our door. And so basically I think we live our lives going bing and bong between system and empathy, trying to find ways to escape and compensate for these systems. And the question in my mind is there anything that goes there, and is that what we want, and what would it look like? Because I think it's the things that go there which are probably really, really valuable, and we can't afford to live our lives down in low system, high empathy land. We are modern. You know, we can't go back to the little house on the prairie and self-sufficient farms, and for all the nostalgia that systems create, and systems create this huge backwash of nostalgia, actually we can't do that. We can't live like that. We can pretend we can for bits, but we can't really. So the really interesting thing, I think, is, well, are there experiences which are high system and then high empathy? And actually then the more you think about it, really good experiences are often combinations of those two things. There's one, I mean, you can just apply this test to different things, but everywhere I go, I like to kind of collect little examples, and there's a fantastic example that I came across in Melbourne. There's a fantastic restaurant in Melbourne called Cumulus, and Cumulus gets you in and out in about 45 minutes. It's a completely systematic experience. They do huge numbers of covers, but it feels deeply empathetic. I mean, because it's very good relational, the atmosphere is convivial. So I would gesture that actually the experience of a really good restaurant is often a combination of unseen systems which allow a kind of conviviality to blossom. That, I think, can also apply to cities. So let me just walk you through two applications of that model. One is cities and one is learning. So that is where you don't want to be. Lagos. I don't know if anyone's ever been to Lagos, but there's one example of Lagos, how scary Lagos can be. When I went to Lagos, I was met at the end of the jetway off the plane by someone whose job was to take me through immigration procedures and baggage collection and then deliver me to the next person who was going to look after me, because that journey was considered risky enough that I would need a special handler. And so you wander around Lagos, and I have absolutely no idea how anyone does it. Everyone seems to be on the make. There seems to be little empathy. It seems complete kind of nightmare. So up here is the image of the city as a kind of Le Corbusier, the city as machine, and they can be busy but dead, these cities. And there are lots of examples of cities like this all over the world. Dubai is like that. Busy but dead. Incheon in Korea is like that. I mean, just miles of beautifully, systematically planned, RFID tagged, wirelessly connected, busy but dead, in my view. So you could go down here, lots of examples of people trying to go down here, garden cities, the new urbanism movement in the States, wicker fences and porches. The High Line in New York has excited huge amounts of interest as a kind of convivial space in a system city. And actually, interestingly, I would say all the favelas I've ever been to, and many of the slums I've been to in Africa, actually are high empathy, low system places. There are no cars. Interesting. One of the things that makes wandering, when you kind of wander around a place and you realize you're more relaxed than you should be, when that happens in a favela, it's often because there are no cars. There's no risk of being run over. There are other risks, but actually they're much more, I mean, the interesting thing that I found going around a lot of these places was I asked people whether they wanted to leave them, and they would all say no, because although they had no proper water and no proper electricity and no system, they had lots of empathy. And I think the best cities are here. They are cities that work at scale, they're efficient, they're reliable, they've probably got better and better systems, but they also create lots of spaces for empathy. Barcelona, Copenhagen, Melbourne, Curitiba, Portland, Toronto, they are places that work, they've got systems, but the systems create the space for lots of empathy. The same, I think, can be said for learning. So this is where I went to school. This is the Vine Comprehensive School in Basingstoke in Hampshire. 2,000 boys, a completely demoralised teaching workforce, where basically all that I learned was A, how to hide, and B, how to run fast when needed. I'd learned absolutely nothing else, and there was no system that I could spot, and there was no empathy. So if you're in a place like that, then going up here to a place that will at least be rigorous and teach to the test, that's an improvement. It's a system. But those places, those schools, are often very cold, very alienating. They can turn a lot of people off. They lead to a lot of people being physically present but psychologically absent, in my view. And so one of the things then you find is a lot of people going for versions of homeschooling, which at least is high empathy but low system. And really, I think the best schools, the best places to learn, the best experiences are all up here, where there's a system, there's a structure, there's a way of doing things, but it's not the most evident thing, and it creates lots of space for relationships. People learn through relationships. And so, again, this combination of system and empathy, if you like, systems that support relationships, not systems that supplant relationships, but support relationships. So this, I think, is a really, for me, you can't live on nostalgia. You can't live on the ideal of the perfectly small scale. A lot of the efficient systems that we have are humiliating and alienating, and so the really big challenge, innovation challenge, social and public and commercial innovation challenge is creating these kinds of systems. These kinds of systems for cities, for learning, for welfare, for work, you name it. And this will be where the really interesting stuff will happen. Well, where could you find systems, or if you like, systempathy? So if I was American, I would now go and form the Systempathy Institute, and I would sell systempathy consulting and write a program about 10 steps to systempathy, but I'm English, so I won't. Where might you find a route to those things? Well, this is just a second diagram, and this is just a different way of thinking about the kinds of innovations that we might need to get to those kinds of systems. So all this says is that there are two kinds of innovation, very crudely. There's sustaining innovation to sustain existing models, and there's disruptive innovation to find entirely new ways to do things, or entirely new ways to do entirely new things. And then there's institutions where we might innovate in their setting, which are familiar, organized, and then there's outside institutions in more informal, less regulated settings where we might innovate. And that just gives you kind of 4 different kinds of ways of thinking about trajectories of innovation. And so what we see, for instance, in the public sector, you see a lot of it in business as well, but in the public sector, is all the effort going in here. We've got these institutions, we employ lots of people, we fund them, let's improve them. And so let's gather best practice, let's measure performance, let's set targets, let's inspect, let's, a whole panoply of measures to improve what we've got. If we could only get the sort of bottom third of the public sector up to the level of the kind of top third, then we would massively improve outcomes. The trouble with this, I think, in much of the public sector, is that many of these models are very costly. I think that many of them are deeply ineffective. They don't really solve problems, they just process them. that they're often incapable of adjusting to new opportunities brought by technology, but also new demands and challenges like aging. And basically, we can get so far with this, and I think it's inescapable to do it, but it's not going to be the way to, for instance, create a society where people age well. I don't think it's even a way to get to a society where people learn well or work well. So what do you see when that kind of runs out of steam and people trying to invent better systems? Well, the first thing that you see is people, or one of the first things is people doing this. We've got these systems, maybe we can combine the system with something outside that goes on that somehow increases the productivity of the system. So let me give you two examples of that. One is from just down the road, Pathways to Education, which started in Regent Park, Carolyn Acker and Norman Rowan. And what they've done with Pathways to Education is they've done nothing to the education system, but they've created a way to support people from those communities so that the education system doesn't spit them out and makes it more navigable and manageable. And by providing the right kind of support and incentive, then you get this innovation outside education, which shows up in much better performance in the education system. So the solution is not in the system, the solution is in the community. Or another one that I know and are very attached to is a network of HIV positive mothers in Africa called Mothers to Mothers, which, I mean, the challenge there, Mitch Besser, an AIDS doctor from America, goes to Africa. His specialism is mother-to-child transmission of HIV. He knows from America that mother-to-child transmission of HIV is virtually unheard of now in America. But in South Africa, it was like 90%. So if the mother was HIV and she was pregnant, it was 90% likely that the child would be born HIV. And he knew that the drugs were there. They had the drugs. They were being funded by all sorts of programs. And he couldn't work out why, when offered the drugs, the mothers often wouldn't take them and, in fact, wouldn't come back to the clinic. So they'd be given their diagnosis. And you can imagine what a kind of shocking diagnosis it would be that you're pregnant and in that moment you find out that you're HIV positive. And in a society where HIV has such stigma, they would just leave, they'd go, they wouldn't come back. And they'd hope that somehow they would get through it, because admitting you're HIV positive would be a kind of living death. And so he worried about this for ages, and finally, almost by chance, one day he saw an older mother who was HIV positive counseling and mentoring a younger mother, and that mother kept on coming back. And so from that, they designed an incredibly simple program, which is just mothers, older often, mothers mentoring other mothers to stick with the program, to deal with the stigma, to overcome all the obstacles, to navigate their way through it, to explain what needed to be done. And suddenly the productivity of the system goes up massively because the women kept coming back. But it's nothing done inside the system, it's something done outside the system. It's something done to increase a level of empathy and social connection with the system to make it what was, in effect, a powerful, potentially efficient, deeply inert system. But by combining this social innovation with it, became much more powerful. The next thing that you see is a lot of people moving down here and saying, well, we need institutions, but what we need are institutions which operate in different ways. So we might need schools, hospitals, and prisons, but we need those that operate in very different ways. So in education all around the world, you see people creating different kinds of school. They're recognizably schools, but they often don't have classrooms. They'll have distributed technology. They'll have much more personalized approaches to learning. They'll have teachers, but also other adults teaching. There'll be a lot of peer-to-peer teaching. In other words, they've taken the school and they've kind of reprogrammed it. And the most radical reinvention of school of that kind, which I've looked at in a book which is coming out in November, is probably this program in Colombia called Escuela Nueva, created by a woman called Vicky Colbert. And Vicky Colbert's problem was rural schools in South America, particularly in her home country, Colombia. So a rural one-teacher multi-grade school, you'll probably have 50 or 60 kids and one teacher. The children will be all different ages, have all sorts of different learning requirements, and one teacher. Well, if you try and teach a school like that in a traditional way, it's almost bound to be a failure. And as a result, the job of being a teacher in a rural school like that is extremely difficult. So Vicky worked with practitioners, brought ideas from America, learned from other programs, and created this very simple, very effective program called Escuela Nueva, which is essentially to create structured learning guides that you can give to groups of children so they can learn with one another in a structured way, and the teacher is helping them to follow the guide. The teacher isn't teaching them directly, the teacher is just helping them to follow the guide. The guide is guiding them to learning. And so in Uganda, where they've adopted this approach, they call it the silent teacher, these guides. And so what Vicky has done is reinvented the school from the inside out and said you can turn these into much more effective systems if you make them relational systems rather than instructional systems. And the final thing that you see then are people trying to do disruptive innovation outside institutions altogether. And so in learning, for instance, this is the domain of people who are trying to promote learning through the web, through open courseware, through games, through all sorts of different initiatives. So the two of the most impressive that I know in that space, Sugata Mitra, Hole in the Wall program, you can see his talks on TED and all the rest of it. But Sugata's basic kind of intuition is that children will be able to teach themselves if they have to, if you create the right environment with the right kind of prompts and the right, in a sense, learning guides, but the learning guides come from computers. And so he tells amazing stories about what he's achieved in India in the harshest conditions, where he put a computer in the wall of his office, thus called the hole in the wall, and just waited to see how long it would take for kids to start using it, children who were illiterate using it, and within 12 hours they were surfing the web. So there are, I think, radical and emerging possibilities, partly enabled by technology, which could allow us to imagine entirely new systems. So if you look at the amazing growth of MIT's open courseware, I mean, it's a very traditional innovation in a way. It's lectures provided online with lecture notes. But what they're really doing, and what I think in the next decade they'll do, is they're creating the new textbook will be the video lecture. So instead of textbooks, you'll have video lectures. There's no reason why you shouldn't get video lectures from anyone, and including the best in the world. And that around that content, increasingly little will be managed and grow, which will become the new classrooms, if you like. That's the possibility. They started that little over 10 years ago. They've had 72 million unique visitors. They thought that most of the visitors would be teachers. Actually, they've been independent learners. And so one of the most amazing things about all of that is the discovery that people want things that you would never imagine. So there's a guy called Gilbert Strang, who was one of the first lecturers at MIT to put a course online. His course is 1806, Linear Algebra. His video lectures on linear algebra have been downloaded 1.8 million times. So there is just enormous appetite, untapped appetite to do things in new ways. So these are then, these are different options, if you like, ways of thinking about how we might get to different kinds of systems. And at the top left will get us better versions of what we've got, but actually these three others, combine, reinvent, and transform, are, I think, where we need much more action, more effort, more money, more experimentation, more bravery. What does it look like when you create things out there? Well, I could talk at great length about what I think is involved. Often these things start in very marginal places. They often start by combining old and new ideas, often borrowed ideas from abroad, brought into localities. They're kind of very eclectic mixes. Very often they require different kinds of financing, foundations to finance them. But looking at these, I've spent the last year looking at 16 high-scale, high-impact innovators in education around the world, including Vicky Colbert in Colombia, the Citizens Foundation in Pakistan, and others. And this is what they say, basically, is that they create things that work, a solution, a learning guide, a way to learn with a computer, an online course, and they create organizations which support those solutions, but then they turn them into movements which can enact change, not just kind of receive it. And they all see themselves in some sense as building movements, and thus they also see themselves as ideological innovators. They believe in some sense of values. It's not just about solving a problem. They believe in a kind of vision of education, or a vision of care, or a vision of health. So the biggest innovators, I think, will be innovators who see their future as creating services and organizations to support those services, which then build networks and movements. And those networks and movements will be underpinned by ideology. They'll be underpinned by a kind of set of values. Now that might sound very political and kind of a bit wacky. So let me finally just give you one example, which is my favorite and perfect example of a kind of way of working at an organization which has turned into and become an ideology and a movement and disrupted an entire global industry. And the example is Barcelona Football Club. Barcelona Football Club is, I think, the most beautiful and most effective and most successful football club there has ever been. And this is what Barcelona has done. So the English invented football. And the English invented football with a system that was a goalkeeper, 2 fullbacks, 3 people in the middle, and then 5 people at the front. It was like a pyramid. And the English played football, basically, and still do, play football in straight lines. The ball goes up and then down, or it goes sideways. And it's sort of at right angles, like that. And the kind of organization of the system of football in that traditional form was that at the back, there were some very, very big blokes whose sole job was to tackle the opposition and get the ball, and then boot it up the field to some other people who would sort of wear white boots and have fancy hairdos, who would sort of dribble, and they were sort of artistic and creative. And then they'd lose the ball, and they wouldn't then do any work to get it back, because the ball would then go up the field, and the big blokes would tackle, kick, foul, and then boot the ball up again. So it was this sort of like, it was like the First World War, really. I mean, it was kind of sort of backward and forward, over the top, you know, kind of so on and so forth. And then in the 1970s, what I think you would describe as a sort of system architect came along, and a sort of disruptor in the form of a guy called Johan Cruyff. And Johan Cruyff was Dutch, and he was about 17, and he was a complete pain in the arse, extremely arrogant, but he had a revolutionary different way of looking at football. And Cruyff's way of looking at football was this, which was, what if everyone could play? Not just the people at the front with the fancy boots, but what if everyone on the field could actually play football? So even the people at the back could control the ball, pass, move, dribble, and they too could play football, not just kick people and balls. So Cruyff's insight was, what would happen if it then became a game of 11 people, not just sort of people at the back and people at the front, and they were all interconnected. And so he created this idea of total football. And the Dutch famously took a goalkeeper to the 1974 World Cup. They took a goalkeeper entirely based on his passing ability, that he was good at passing the ball, not at saving shots. So Cruyff wins 2 European Cups with Ajax, and the Dutch team are brilliant but tragic, and Cruyff goes off to Barcelona. And the philosophy of Barcelona, importantly, you know, embedded in the ownership of the club, which is a mutual membership. It's a movement which involves people. It's in this amazing city, which has a very distinctive account of itself culturally and politically, which goes back a long way to the Civil War and beyond. it has this academy in which people are schooled in the system in a very, very kind of apprentice-like way, produces in the last few years the absolute kind of, pinnacle of total football, which is the side you see at the moment under Pep Guardiola. And when you see them play, what do you see? Well, you see a system. It's definitely a system. It's a way of playing that they're all schooled in, but it's completely relational because they're so used to playing with one another, they kind of know in instinct where one another is. And this is the way the system works. As soon as you lose the ball, you work as hard as possible to get it back as quickly as possible because you don't want to run all the way back to the other end of the field. So get it back as quickly as possible and then keep it. The best way to defend is to keep the ball and prevent the opposition getting it. So how do you do that? Well, you pass. Pass, pass, pass. You won't get the ball unless you are in a position to pass to someone else. You won't get the ball unless you're in space. So look for space and look for who you're going to pass it to. So you won't get the ball from someone else unless they can see that you're also in a network with someone else who you can pass it on to. And so the ball is in constant circulation. It doesn't belong to anyone. It's constantly moving. And then they never, ever play a ball in a straight line. They never go up and across. They only ever go at different angles. So it's like a sort of collective exploration of this sort of complex geometry where the ball is constantly revolving and they're constantly exploring for different angles, and then finally when they get it, they go through and they score. And so they keep possession over and over again. Now this is a system, highly creative system, that is also built on relationships, which maximizes all its resources and treats everyone as a participant, and so is a collective undertaking. And it's built on a set of beliefs, which is football should be played this way. And we only really want to win by playing football in this kind of way. So that, it seems to me, is a kind of a version of the kind of systems that we would want. What would it be like if you worked in a system like that? Or if a hospital worked like that? Or if a school worked like that? Really worked on the Barcelona principle rather than the old English principle, up and down and across. And so that, I think, is a kind of one insight for me into a disruptive innovation that's completely transformed the way that people think about a sport and has created a completely different model. And it's that kind of innovation that we need in education, in health, in care, in welfare, in transport, in energy, in virtually any field you like to mention. It's going to be innovation to create new systems. And that will come from people who lead entire movements, it seems to me, round ideologies to create new forms of organization. And those will invariably come from the edges of public systems. And the key thing is how public systems will work to work with them and accommodate them rather than resisting them. And the more that public systems are able to accommodate and work with that kind of change, the more successful places will be, basically. The more rigid they are, the more you'll get this distinction between efficient but cold, busy but dead, and occasionally relational, and hope that you get lucky and find the right relationship. And so I think there are big stakes, and I think there are also huge opportunities for people to create new ways of doing things. And that is why social and public innovation is so exciting, and why it needs really great people backed with great places and great resources, which is why you're lucky that you have this kind of place here and these kinds of people. Thank you.
Great. I think we just take these.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I don't know if we have to turn. We don't. I was just thinking about that football analogy that I think the British lost the American states using that same methodology.
What the up and down
the
methodology?
red coats and versus the American
It's very
guerrillas.
deeply ingrained.
They should have learned their lesson. So we're going to take questions now. So why don't you, I guess there's a couple of microphones here. Why don't you just line up I think the way we've done this before is that people have just come forward and we'll try and, we've got about half an hour, and we'll try and accommodate as many of you as possible. And maybe while you're thinking of the question that you'd like to ask Charlie, I'll just pick off where you left and pick up where you left and ask you to talk a little bit more about this relationship when a social inventor or an innovator perfects their model and then builds a movement around it, and then that movement then intersects or interacts with a more long-standing institution or system. Could you talk a little bit more about that tension, that relationship, and what's, what kind of innovation might be required on both sides when that intersection occurs?
Yeah. Well, generally speaking, it's not a very pleasant experience, and it can often be quite unnecessarily difficult, I think. Basically, governments and big systems, I think, need a constant flow of new ideas, which often they find it very difficult to generate from within. And often social innovators need resources and respectability, but also scale, which is often very difficult to organize outside those systems, which are very powerful. But often the systems will say, well, we'd love to, but it's too difficult, it's too risky. We've got all these targets, and trade unions won't like it. And anyway, these social innovators, they're very flaky because they can't show the value of what they're creating. And so often that relationship doesn't work. It doesn't. So where does it work when it works well? Well, one is you find this combinatory thing that Pathways has done, which is it's sort of, the thing about Pathways is that it's sort of like no risk for the system. We're not going to change you, we're not going to mess around with you, we're just going to make your jobs a lot easier. So we're going to be a kind of provider to you, or a kind of almost like an outboard motor to the system. Then you find people like Escuela Nueva who say, actually, we're going to reprogram the system by providing it with new software, but actually with the same teachers in the same schools, you can get better outcomes. And the key thing in that model was the people who sold it were teachers. The teachers sold it to other teachers. So you can get that kind of reprogramming going on. You can find models, I think, which are simply inspirational. They don't attempt to replicate themselves, but what they want to do is promote principles that others can follow. So the Reggio Emilia model of child development, which is very well known, they've made no attempt to scale that as an organization, but the principles have scaled. So I think there are a whole variety of ways in which movements can interact with systems. And the more productive that interface becomes, the more creative communities will be, it seems to me. Because, look at Citizens Foundation in Pakistan. The Citizens Foundation is an amazing thing. It's a kind of funded by citizens' donations. They've built 730 schools in about less than a decade, and they teach about just over 100,000 children. That's 0.5% of Pakistan's children. So in order to get scale, they have to influence government. And so they have to find ways to both advocate, influence, and get bits of the system that they can run without becoming then neutered by the system.
I'm happy to keep asking here. Okay, please.
So I've got a question. We'll see how well articulated it is. First, thank you for coming and for your talk. So I work for a small nonprofit, and I really like it because we don't have a ton of systems. And as you said at the beginning of your talk, there becomes a point where sometimes the systems, I guess, become ossified, and you start to serve the system, whereas it was once created to serve you. And I guess when I think about the public sector and the bureaucracy, and I really think about how firmly entrenched kind of systems are there, I wonder, where is the latitude for innovation? Where is that opportunity going to come? And I kind of imagine one possible outcome is that it's going to require a complete collapse in order to regenerate a new solution that's much more networky and organic, or there has to be some kind of incremental change, but it's really hard for me to imagine that. I think the same thing about the parliamentary system and the whole political system of these separate parties that have to kind of vote along party lines, and so I see these rigid structures that we've inherited, and I'm just wondering if you could say a few words about, is it incremental? Is it us on the outside working with those systems to, through that interface, create innovation, or can innovation actually happen within these systems, and how will it, given how entrenched and ossified some of these structures are? So I don't know if that comes across, but that's...
Well, I suppose the thing that I would say is that it's very important to... I completely recognise and agree with all the limitations that you're talking about, and that by and large in our work at Participle, basically it's virtually impossible to have new big ideas inside systems. You can have small improving ideas or maybe just about reinventing ideas, but it's very difficult to ask a completely different question or take it from a completely different vantage point inside the system. But if you're outside the system, it's very difficult to get any resources to scale, and all the resources are trapped in the system. So eventually you have to get back and interact with it. So it's a sort of necessary kind of thing. I mean, the thing that I would say is that a lot of these ideas, my experience, a lot of these ideas come from completely marginal places and marginal people who seem to be, kind of odd, wacky, special, different. And yet it's those places where new ideas will start from. But that won't tell you how you grow them necessarily, because to grow them you need something more, and that's when you need to combine that kind of innovation with a kind of emphasis on what's taken to scale, and that often requires a degree of simplicity about it. So Mothers to Mothers started with Mitch and these mothers and developing this thing, but one of the reasons it's gone to scale is that the co-founder is a guy called Gene Falk, and Gene's background is building entertainment channels in television, and he just brought to the idea of building this movement, how would you build huge entertainment channels? So there's a sort of bit to developing which is very important. But then the other thing is, don't discount the possibility that there are all sorts of people in the interstices of the system who might want to innovate, who are your potential allies. And it's finding those people who are mavericks inside the system, which is critical, who might just give you your opening or your toehold, or they might be at any level. So particularly valuable are maverick politicians and maverick chief executives who will sanction change, but also, slightly wacky practitioners and what have you. Do you see what I mean? So I think that the whole process is a process of breaking down coalitions that ossify things and creating new coalitions which open things up. And in that, it's a mistake to prejudge whether people inside systems represent the system, and often they don't.
Yes, please.
Thank you. A lot of times when you look at innovation, policymakers and the institutions like to focus on tangible widgets, and that's their interpretation of innovation. But I think from what I saw and heard, a lot of the innovation that you're talking about is radical behavior change, or maybe not so much radical behavior change, but behavior change which causes a system shift. What kind of argument would you use to those staid thinkers who think that it has to be a widget or a toy or a box or a whatever?
I completely agree with you, and I think that one of the things that you see is in this sort of desire to try and create new systems, one of the things that leads to that reinvention thing is often, let's build a new building. And the new building will embody the new system and it make it possible. And in fact, it rarely does, unless you've already got the idea and the idea will lead the building. The building certainly will never lead the system, that's for sure. So there is that desire to see that. And so what you then have to do, it seems to me, is you have to, it's a really big problem, I think, because what you have to say to people is, look, let's not build a new building, let's build a new culture or a new way of doing things or a new capability, and you can see the outcomes in these ways. So what you have to do is try and make that tangible through measurement, stories, accounts, so on and so forth. But what you also have to do is you have to attack the current system at its weakest points. And you have to hold it to account. And that's often what we don't do. You have to say, look, this is not working. Or better, choose systems to attack where it's evident it's not working. So I am still, I mean, one of the things that really depresses me is how difficult it is to get people into a different conversation about criminal justice and punishment when it's evident that the prison system is so dysfunctional that virtually there's no cost, it seems to me, in innovating different ways to do punishment and prison and all the rest of it. So it's not a kind of surefire success. But for instance, we did this project, Participle did this project with families, where called chronic crisis families, families with sort of multiple behavioral kind of dysfunctions and issues, often interacting with many public services, very, very costly. They live pretty miserable lives. They're often deeply socially isolated. They've got no sense of the future or hope or anything like that. And they're in receipt often of services that just come in, leave, come in, leave, in, like salami slicing. And we did this project and we just audited the cost of what was happening and just then presented it back to the council that we were working with and audited the work patterns of the social worker and put that back. And so accounting for the current system, that it's not a no-risk option, that it's not a low cost necessarily sticking with the status quo. So I think you've got to be prepared to really attack that and get people to think, actually, it's not working, is it? It's not doing what it's supposed to do.
I just want to know in terms of, it seems to me the relationship question has a lot to do with connectivity. And the first part of what you're talking about had a lot to do with communication. It seems to me that innovation in communication has been at the root of a lot of change, postal service, telephone, internet. And the kind of other aspect of connectivity that I can see is transportation. And so innovation that's happening, that level of connectivity, automobile, airplanes. So in terms of connectivity, there's kind of the communication side that I see and transportation, and the innovation in those two fields have really impacted connectivity and relationships in that way. So I was wondering if you could speak to where maybe, what are some of the other areas in terms of, technology that could impact our connectivity in that way, and in our relationships because of that?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. As far as I know, this might be wrong, but someone told it to me who I trust. So the age at which American teenagers get their driving license is going up, because basically the car's a social technology. It's a way to meet friends. But if you've got other technologies to do that, then you don't need to go and drive. Therefore, it becomes less compelling. And it is very interesting what's happening to the car and the way that the car is viewed. Because even for my generation, getting a car was a really big thing. It was a real rite of passage. And now there are different rites of passage, which are both sort of material and social, which are to do with smartphones, computers, so on and so forth. So I suspect that part of what the cities of the future are going to be about is rethinking the whole thing around communication, public space and transport systems. And part of that will be how to completely rethink cars and ownership and sharing, and that the really effective cities of the future will have forms of transportation which will be shared but personal, and that cars, the kind of association of freedom, car, private ownership, which is foundational to modern capitalism, I think is about to come to an end, I would say. I think that in 20 years, I think the generation growing up with all this stuff don't see cars in that way. I mean, it will be a different kind of industry. So I think that's fundamental. But then what you would need, I think, as a city would be to get a whole bunch of people to think about how people move in cities, why they move, do they need to move, how can they move together in the most effective way, which would be, multi-ownership and multimodal. And then part of that then suggests that actually the most innovative car companies in the world will be social innovators, actually. I mean, they'll create new cars, but they'll create new ways to share cars, to own cars, to manage cars together, new systems for doing that, which will turn the car, at least some of the time for some of the people, into a shared thing rather than a private thing, I think. And the reason I say all that is that I think then the task is to get the car companies to see themselves as social innovators, and not just the social innovators who happen. Do you see what I mean? It's to get those people to see the value that they create in a different kind of way. And if we can do that, and if cities can create ways to do that, that will be a really important step forward. Because there's no doubt, I mean, if you look at India and China, the idea that you could get that rate of urbanization with that level of private car ownership, it's like we might as well just pack up and go home. Do you know what I mean? So we need some radically different way of thinking about all of that. And where does that come from? That will come from people like Robin Chase creating Zipcar and Street Van and Go Local. And it will come partly from people who look very marginal. Because they are the people who are prepared to kind of think outside conventional wisdom. It won't come from GM.
I always find it impossibly charming, the English self-deprecating humor. But so far the English aren't very good at having a conversation with a wine bottle and at playing football. But I was hoping I could give you the chance to say something nice about England and what you see as maybe like a beacon of social innovation coming out of your home country, either within institutions or not within institutions. And I know lots of people said that the big society stuff was a lot of hot air and election gimmicks. But in either case, whether you agree with that or not, what do you see as an interesting case study coming out of England of social innovation that's either transformative or disruptive?
Well, I mean, there is. I would say I think that where we are strongest is where we connect back to older traditions of mutual social organization, which perhaps predate industrial organization in some sense. And so when we're at our strongest, it's when we connect sort of very old traditions with very new ways of doing things. And so I think there's been innovation in the UK and continues to be in lots of areas of social finance, new forms of social interest company, community interest company, that kind of stuff. So we've got a massive stuff going on, and there's quite a lot of innovation in bits of the public sector. But the thing that I've been involved with most recently, which I think we still have huge potential to do stuff with, is rather depressing, but it's the end of life and death and dying that England produced, the hospice, modern hospice movement. And if there was ever a place where system and empathy needed to combine, but actually, 85%, if you ask people in Britain where they want to die, so roughly 90% of them will say they want to die at home. 85% of them will die in hospital or in a care home at the moment. And death and dying and the conditions in which people die are responsible for 50% of all complaints to the NHS, because hospitals basically are not the right place for most people to die, and yet that's where they end up. So they end up trapped in these systems, which are medical systems, trying to cope with people who are trying, kind of to negotiate the end of life. They've no space for social or psychological care. So actually, there's a massive innovation going on around that, which I think is absolutely vital and very impressive. So I think there are strong, I am kind of doing us down, I suppose, but Britain, I think, has a strong tradition of mutual, self-organized, local, that kind of innovation, and that's a really important source of new ideas for the future as well.
Oh, and one other one is the organization you referenced a couple of times tonight, the Participle, which perhaps is this combination of the old and the new or the modern. And you've, among many things with Participle, you've ushered in the world of design, and there's a story behind that. But I wondered if you could, for the benefit of all of us here, talk a little bit about some of those core design elements associated with Participle that seem to show up, as a universal.
Yeah, so Participle started from design and from design thinking and applying it to public policy challenges. And, for a long time, and we still, to some extent, trade on the fact that people involved in public policy never meet anyone, basically. So if you present people with a kind of insight into the lives of people they're making policy for, they're deeply shocked and surprised and amazed that you can tell them. So some of the things that are really basic to design are so unusual in the land of policymaking. Ethnography, user insight, making prototypes, making new designs visible, all of that kind of stuff. So that's where we started, but where we got to, we started as a kind of unit of the Design Council, which was the official design body for Britain. And what we got fed up with was, and it came to a head over health, was the idea that the role of design was to create better signage in hospitals. And that was all that we could offer. We could create a better way for people to navigate their way around hospitals. And design then becomes a sort of little add-on. And what we wanted to do was what's the biggest health challenge in the UK? The biggest health challenge is not signage in hospitals, it's diabetes. And the rise of long-term conditions. And actually, if you then start looking at long-term conditions, actually hospitals aren't very much help with that, because by the time someone gets to a hospital with a long-term condition, they're already in too much trouble. And you've already, this place where insulin was discovered, diabetes costs the NHS £5 million a week because of those kind of things. So we started with diabetes, and we looked at we started working with groups of diabetics and looking at their interaction with systems. And we created two things we did. It's amazing what insight you get from simply bothering to follow people around and look at how they live their lives rather than just look at the systems and the services. So we went to Bolton. We went to Bolton and Kent, and in Bolton, we did two things. We tracked this guy, sort of 50s guy, who had diabetes, and he said that he had to go and see a nurse in his GP practice twice a year, and he'd been doing this for 16 years, and for 16 years she'd asked him the same questions. The same set of questions, all delivered from a computer screen, not looking at him. Blah, blah, blah. So we created a pack of cards that you could sort of put out on the table, and you could pick up the cards that you thought were most important. So we had a discussion with him and his wife around the kitchen table with this pack of cards. And he left the room, and his wife picked up the card which said, "Diabetes affects your sex life," and put it in the middle of the table. And so he came back in, and so then we had a discussion with them about why diabetes affects your sex life and why that was really critical. 16 years, no one had mentioned the fact that diabetes could affect your sex life. So this was kind of, well, in order to find out what problems you're trying to solve, you've got to get into a conversation with the people whose problems they are in a language which is their language, not your language. And so then that led to, well, the problems and the solutions are probably not going to be in either new forms of institution, but new forms of capability. how can people manage that in more cooperative, more informed, more able kind of ways? And that then led to this idea that actually the solutions of many of the problems that we would look for would be outside institutions, where you could get professional knowledge into them, but the solutions would be distributed, cooperative, involve people as participants, so on and so forth. And that's our kind of mantra now. That's where we start from. We try and look at through the lens of that, not through the lens of the institution.
And the design principle around participle that really jolted me was your move, and I assume it's related to this story, or comes out of that story as well, is the move from an individual-centric model of care to a network or a family-centric model of care as well. We're getting close to the end. Okay, I had one more question for you, but please come. Okay. Yeah. Are we okay, Geraldine, to go for a few more minutes?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. I have a question which may be impossible to answer, but in thinking through some of the large global urgent problems like climate change, international poverty, and so on, we have a problem of limited resources. There are probably far too resources compared to the size of the problem. And we also have the pressure of time. You talked about 3 types or 4 types of innovation, but said that we need more focus on combining, transforming, and I think the other was reinventing.
Yeah.
If you had to choose among those, would you put more emphasis on any one of those given these sort of large global problems?
If you're talking about large and global problems, which I think you're absolutely right to do, so when I looked at this in terms of education, I did this thing called learning from the extremes, and the basic premise of that was, instead of going to look at Finland, which has the best education system in the world, which is like the French wine industry, and trying to copy that, go to the places where the need is greatest, which is in the cities of the developing world amongst the poorest, youngest populations, and work out what solutions would work there. So the first thing I would say is you've got to go to where the problem is and where the potential solutions need to work, not where you think the resources and the ideas are. And all those issues, a lot of those issues that you talk about, both poverty and climate, come down to cities in the developing world, basically. The future is going to be made in big cities in the developing world. What kind of solutions work there? They are not big institutional industrial infrastructure. Some can work for some bits of them, maybe for aspects of transport, but they're going to be, I suspect, much more networked, much more dispersed, much more self-help, much more adaptive, much more grow their own resources. And they're going to have to think about things through a different lens. So, in education, the basic point that I kept on coming back to was that the traditional professional service model of education was both inefficient, ineffective, and too expensive. And so all across the developing world, you have school systems which are underfunded and underperforming and just doing really badly, and lots of people are desperate to learn. So you need a different kind of model. So I would say transform. And then I think the other thing is that I would say that you're definitely right that we face these growing crunches of both demography, climate, shift of resources east, shift of activity east, and all the rest of it. But I'm not sure that we actually lack resources. I'm not sure fundamentally, for instance, in energy, I am persuaded really that there's enough energy around. It's just in the wrong forms, in the wrong places. And actually, if we could reinvent energy grids in some solar-based, network-based way, then a lot of those problems might disappear or at least be ameliorated. So the resource constraints may actually be constraints of our imagination, social organization, and business model rather than technology.
Thank you.
So my last question to you is, I know you've got a book went to the printer this weekend. We're profiling pathways here in Regent Park, and immediately after the session I want to introduce you to Mary Gordon and John Mighton, 2 other innovators, and we'll get that into the next edition of that book. And I know you're thinking about another book. So what are you thinking beyond the next book? So in other words, what's churning around? So it's not formed yet. It's just an impulse or an instinct or a spot in your imagination right now. What crossroads are you at?
Well, I mean, the next book is, I've got to write this book about systems and empathy, and that is what's churning around. And I do, there's a lot in that which I haven't kind of yet got to about the nature of empathy. And I'm very interested in, I mean, roots of empathy is kind of squarely in this game, I know, but is the question of how you really generate empathy is a very, but the thing that I have found myself doing, which I didn't expect to do, and I think this is just a sort of personal thing, but I don't think you can innovate without taking detours and finding yourself doing things that you didn't expect, is that I've spent the last year, I suppose, reading a whole slew of stuff that's come out of behavioral economics, evolutionary psychology, biology, anthropology, which is about cooperation. And so, there's the sort of very crude story is much of our thinking about the world is formed on a completely mythical account of our nature as competitive, and that nature is a competitive process. And so, embodied in the selfish gene, sociobiology and all of that stuff, nature is red in tooth and claw. And then on top of that, we build systems around self-interest, which are either to unlock self-interest, the market, Adam Smith, or to control self-interest, Hobbes and the state. Actually, what if that was just wrong? And actually, what if actually fundamentally we're cooperative? And actually what we should be designing is systems to build on our cooperation rather than to unlock our competition. And there's just so much stuff now out of this new science of cooperation, which says basically we are who we are because we cooperate. And it's cooperation which is fundamental to us. So the thing that I'm sort of toying with is what would it look like if government adopted across government a cooperation policy rather than a competition policy? Because so much of our policy making has been built on self-interest and cooperation. What if instead, as a counterpoint to that, we just said, okay, we're just going to look for every opportunity we can take to build cooperation. And then, this is my last idea, is that what I'd really like to do is that there is this sort of 2080 rule. And this has dominated a lot of economic policy making, and I have played my own role in that, which is you've got to create incentives for the go-getting, entrepreneurial, risk-taking people. And they will create the wealth, and Britain is kind of, held to ransom by people saying, if you do that, we're going to go to Geneva, or we're going to go to, somewhere else to take our business if you tax us in that way. So it's driven by this kind of fear of that. What if you could design public policy to reward the super altruists? And what if the super altruists in society were the real objects, they were the real wealth creators? So if you had a policy which said, we are going to find ways to promote, reward, protect the people in our society who promote altruism, what would that be like, and how would you do it? Because there's lots of evidence from all sorts of things that societies work only because there are groups of people who are prepared to be openly altruistic, and they are protected against being done over by the non-altruistic, who are a very tiny minority. So that's sort of, what if we've just got it completely wrong, in other words? So this is by way of an apology to a guy that I was at university with, who I thought at the time was completely bonkers. Because we did economics together, and when we did economics, the start of the economics course, which is sort of how easy it is to do, at the start of the first lecture was, if you assume self-interest, and he put his hand up and he said, but what if you assume not self-interest? Why should we assume self-interest? I just shut up. If you assume self-interest, and that's it, the path has been solved. If you assume self-interest. What if you assume not self-interest? What would that be like? That's what I'd really like to work on.
Well, we'll assume this is just the beginning of the conversation. You haven't been to Canada that often, but I can assure you you'll have lots of invitations when you're through your sojourn across the country. So, Charlie, thanks very much for the day and for coming here this evening and delighting us. Shall we give him a warm Canadian welcome?